Welcome back to my channel, and today we're going to tackle this very persistent myth that's draining astronomers' bank accounts worldwide. I nearly fell into this trap too. If you're new here, I share practical astronomy tips every week. Hit subscribe to join our cosmic journey and learn much more about astrophotography. I've been recently thinking whether or not I should upgrade from my modest 130mm reflector telescope to a larger telescope, say 8 or 11 inches. They cost quite a lot of money, but would the images justify me spending so much money? That's the question I'm seeking to answer in this particular video. Let me tell you why I don't think this is such an obvious answer to this question of whether bigger apertures are really better, because it's often said that. Aperture is just one factor in a complex equation. Let me explain what aperture actually is first and why it matters in terms of visual astronomy and also in astrophotography. For visual astronomy, just looking through your eyepiece, aperture is indeed crucial. A larger aperture means more light is collected more quickly, and this means brighter views. As you can see here, comparing an aperture of diameter 5 inches, such as the one that I use, to one with 12 inches results in the larger aperture having an area which is 5.5 times bigger, meaning that it also collects light 5.5 times more quickly than a smaller one. Because it is the area of aperture that makes the difference, doubling the aperture in the size would mean 4 times as much light is collected because the radius is squared to calculate the area of a circle. It's really basic maths, isn't it? But note, unlike many other videos that I've seen on this topic, I'm not going to bamboozle you with fancy maths or difficult formulae, because they're there for sure, but how boring would that be, really? Note in this example as well that the focal ratio is f5 for both scopes, so we can make a direct comparison. Some telescopes may have different focal ratios. A higher focal ratio would mean that objects would appear dimmer in the telescope, and a lower focal length will make them brighter. So you've heard me talk about focal ratio, but you may be wondering, what is focal ratio? So let's think about this for a moment. Focal ratio is actually focal length over aperture. So in other words, if we increase the aperture, we'll decrease the focal ratio. Looking at this, at the diagram that I've just created, you can see slow and fast. Now, a slow system has a higher focal ratio, and a faster system has a lower focal ratio. Now, what exactly does this mean? In the diagram, I've shown you two examples, one with a smaller telescope aperture and one with a much larger telescope aperture. The focal lengths are the same, and the focal length is the point where the light comes to focus. Now, I think you could see in this diagram immediately that a larger aperture means that more light is collected. So focal ratio is not really to do with the amount of light that is collected. It's more to do with how the light is concentrated. So it reaches focus at the same point, but obviously in the slow system, the higher focal ratio, there's going to be less light being focused on a small area. Whereas in the second system, with the larger aperture, there's going to be more light collected at that small point, which means that it's going to be faster. That just means that the exposure time for astrophotography Or, in terms of visual astronomy, the image will appear brighter. And that's what I tried to show on the last slide. A bigger aperture will also allow you to see more detailed views, as it has better resolving power. So what exactly is resolving power? It's a telescope's ability to distinguish fine details. It's a measure of how well a telescope can show 2 points of light as distinct and separate rather than just blurred together. In simple terms, it determines the level of detail you can see through your telescope. Okay, so much for visual astronomy. Astrophotography is a very different game, and it plays by very different rules. And understanding this distinction may stop you from rushing out to spend a load of cash on a larger scope. With caution is a good idea when it comes to choosing aperture size, and let me tell you why. Larger apertures do sound like a great idea, but there are a few other factors that do affect whether a large aperture is for you or not. Number one, your local seeing conditions may not allow you to get the full benefit from a larger aperture, so it's wise to take this into account. If you are imaging under light pollution, as most of us are, larger apertures will collect more of it, and this will affect your views. And if doing astrophotography, you may have to use lower exposure times. Number three, larger apertures have two big disadvantages: cost and weight. If you don't have a large budget or you prefer portability, then better to stick with more manageable equipment. Okay, now let's discuss astrophotography and find out just how important aperture is. The aperture myth persists because it's partially rooted in truth. Larger apertures do collect more light, and light is the currency of astronomy. But here's what's changed. Digital cameras can now collect light over extended periods, unlike our eyes. Modern CMOS sensors are incredibly sensitive, and today's image stacking software can combine multiple exposures, effectively multiplying your light collection. So now let's take a look at some real-world examples. Do you think there's much difference between these two images? One was taken with my telescope worth about $500, a 130mm Newtonian reflector telescope, and the other with a telescope worth about $70,000 and an aperture of 70 centimeters. It's not an exact comparison, I'll admit, because my photo was taken in my backyard in light polluted skies, and I have a relatively cheap camera as well, ASI 533 MC Pro, which is a one-shot color camera. The other image is from shots that were taken at altitude in a less light polluted area and with a much more sensitive and expensive camera. In both cases, exposure of each photograph was 5 minutes. These were stacked and processed by me using the same software and to the best of my ability. So can you guess which is which? Let's see if you've managed to guess correctly. Image B is the image that I created from my backyard with a 130mm 5-inch aperture reflector telescope. Image A is from an observatory high up in less polluted skies in Spain with a telescope of 70 centimeters aperture, which is 27.5. Did you manage to guess? Do you think the difference in aperture has made a huge difference? Has it made any difference at all? I'd really love to know what you think in the comments below. So do share your thoughts. So how is it possible for my image to be so good in comparison? The answer is exposure time. Image B, taken with my 130mm aperture, was created from 134 5-minute subs, or a total of around 11 hours exposure time. Image A, with the large 70 centimeter aperture, was created from just over 3 hours, shot equally through 4 filters: luminosity, red, green, and blue, 50 minutes in each filter. So what factors actually determine your astrophotography success? Let's break it down. First, focal ratio matters more than aperture, and we've talked about focal ratio quite a bit up to this point. A f5 refractor gathers light 4 times faster than an f10 Schmidt-Cassegrain, for example, despite having less than half the aperture. Second, tracking accuracy is absolutely crucial. With good tracking, your stars should be really pinpoint and round. Even if you expose for minutes at a time, I often expose for up to 5 minutes or 6 minutes at a time, and the stars need to be really round. There's nothing worse than getting oblong-shaped, ugly-looking stars. And of course, it's not only the stars. If your stars are blurred or if your stars are not tracked well, then the nebula or galaxy that you're imaging will also not be tracked well, and you won't get a sharp image. Third, image stacking transforms results. It really does. There's an incredible difference between a single shot and a shot with many exposures stacked together. It's incredible that the stacked image has better detail and less noise, despite using the total exposure time. This means that with extra exposure time and stacking, we can overcome a smaller aperture. Fourthly, field of view really matters for many targets. Some targets, like the North American Nebula, are huge, and you need a much smaller wide field lens, much smaller aperture, which will give you a more wide field of view. Others, like planetary nebula, are really very tiny, and you need a long focal length so you can really zoom into those targets. Fifth, and perhaps most important, the gear you use actually beats any gear that stays at home stored away. So my smaller setup is really portable, and I take it everywhere and use it a lot. It's easy to set up as well. My larger scope, I can't really take that anywhere. So guess which one I use more often? I'm not saying aperture never matters in astrophotography. For certain specific applications, it absolutely does matter. Planetary imaging, for example, benefits from larger apertures because you can resolve much finer details. Very small, faint deep sky objects can require more light gathering power. For example, I recently saw this with the antennae galaxies, and I really couldn't get a decent image with my 130 millimeter aperture Celestron SLT. Yet with another telescope, these would come out really beautiful. And if you want one telescope for both visual observation and photography, a larger aperture might be the right compromise. The key is understanding your specific targets and choosing appropriate equipment. Don't just blindly follow the bigger is better mantra, because it's often just a myth. Based on my own experience and conversations with many other astrophotographers, here's my practical advice concerning aperture. If you're a beginner, start with a small, high-quality refractor, say 70 to 100 millimeters, or a fast Newtonian like I use, on a solid computerized mount. Focus on mastering techniques rather than using large aperture. If you're an intermediate imager, consider your specific targets, the ones that you like to image. If you love wide field nebulae, which are quite small, but you want to get the whole general area of the nebulae, stick with shorter focal lengths. If planets are your passion, then yes, you should consider more aperture, because the more aperture you have, the more detail you'll get in your shots of planets. And for advanced astrophotographers, consider specialized setups for different targets rather than one do-it-all instrument. I image DSOs, deep sky objects, such as nebulae and galaxies, and it's nice to have at least two different scopes, one with less and one with more aperture, since the focal lengths are usually longer with larger aperture scopes, and then you can image both small and larger targets as you want. The aperture myth has led countless astrophotographers down an expensive path with disappointing results. By understanding what really matters, focal ratio, tracking, processing skills, and target appropriate equipment, you can take incredible photos without breaking the bank. I'd love to see what results you get with the aperture and setup you have. Have you taken an image recently? Why don't you share it with us in the comments below? It doesn't take a moment. Just post a link to your shot, whether it's on Instagram, Twitter, or wherever, and I'll feature the best shots in my next video. Make sure to include details of the aperture, the exposure time, and the setup you use for the shots. If you found this video helpful, please hit that like button. It takes a second and it really helps me out. And subscribe for more practical astronomy tips. I don't think I've actually decided what I'm going to do in my next video, but I've got lots and lots coming up for you about image processing and lots of questions that I'm trying to answer in these videos. So I hope you look forward to that. Thanks for watching.